Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Bob Kelly. I'm with the Historic Advisory Committee, and we sponsor talks on local history and have been doing it for quite a while. We've got 2 more talks coming up this spring. In 2 weeks, we have a talk on History Unleashed, Lafayette's Western New York Tour, and it's a 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to Geneva, Canandaigua, Victor, and into Rochester. So a hero of the American Revolution coming back and touring the country. And on June 8th, we've got fascinating railroad connections with Joel Richter, a local railroad enthusiast. So we've been very blessed with the speakers. And I'm very proud today to introduce someone special to me, my brother. He's the intellectual and the smartest person in the family. And Jack started out as a writing sort of hard-nosed detective novels, and a couple of people came in. They said, well, the last time we saw Jack here, he was talking about the mob in Rochester, and that was Appalachian. That was your first real novel. Was about a little town in the Catskills, Appalachian, where they sort of discovered that there was a mob in the United States, and so it was a fictional account of that. And so Jack wrote fiction for a while and then switched to writing history, and really has a knack for telling the story and finding the characters and bringing out the story in a way that we can remember and relate to. So really pleased to have him here. He's got a few of his books are in the back. He's God Save Benedict Arnold is was it 2 or 3 years ago that came out?
Well, yeah.
Band of Giants, about the people that the heroes really of the American Revolution, and individual stories about those people. The Edge of Anarchy, which is about the Pullman strike. And then Heaven's Ditch was based on the talk today is based on the talk about the Erie Canal and the effect it had on this country. When Western New York was really the center of intellectual ferment and things that were going on. It's hard to believe that we were the center of anything like that, but at that time we certainly were. So I am very pleased to introduce my brother, Jack Kelly.
Thank you, Bob. And I would just say the Mutual Admiration Society, I think all of you know Bob is not only knowledgeable about history, but was one of the pillars of Victor for many years, taught in school here, was on the rescue squad, Serenity House and hospice care, and has given a lot to this community, so he really deserves a little round of applause himself. And to tie in the next talk, Lafayette was one of the first people to ride the Erie Canal down its entire length, because it was 1825 that he came over here, and it was 1825 they finished the canal, and they had the big celebration in the fall of that year, which is going to be replicated this year as we reach the bicentennial of the canal. So I'm going to talk for about a half an hour or 40 minutes, and then have questions, comments, anything that you know about it that, you know, a lot of people know local history better than I do. If you have comments, it'd be great to hear what you know about the Erie Canal. I grew up quite near the Erie Canal, and we used to go down and watch the barges go through the locks. It was a fascinating thing to see these big barges rising up and down. And we also went, I would ride with my family through Palmyra, New York, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and we would go by Hill Cumorah, and invariably somebody would say, that's where he found the golden tablets. And I didn't know who they were talking about or what the golden tablets were, but it was fascinating as a kid to imagine you could go out in your backyard and dig down and there's gold there. So I got interested in the subject, and the first thing, this is me looking at the barges. I'm not in the picture there, but one of the old tugboats in the canal. The first thing I learned about the canal was that all the Great Lakes, except for Lake Ontario, from Lake Erie all the way up to Lake Superior, are almost on the same elevation. They're about a little over 500 feet above sea level. Lake Ontario is the exception, is down 200 or 300 feet below that. So if you could get to Lake Erie and connect Lake Erie to Albany, which is over here, Albany's at sea level. So that was the promise of the Erie Canal, was to open up all that land you see in the upper Great Lakes all the way out to Duluth. Cities that weren't there at the time, Chicago, all would have access through the canal to the East Coast. And I'm going to talk in a minute a lot about the religious and political upheavals along a canal, but the idea for the canal itself was based on a vision. There was this guy, Jesse Hawley, on the left, and he lived in Geneva, and he was a broker, and he would buy wheat from local farmers, have it ground in Seneca Falls, and then send it down to markets in New York City, and this is in the early 1800s. But the transportation costs really were so high, and you can imagine how much a horse can pull and big barrels of flour, and a horse has to eat, and a horse has to rest, and it added up, and the transportation costs drove him into bankruptcy. And they didn't have bankruptcy then, they sent you to debtor's prison. And he got 20 months in debtor's prison for his business going under. While he was there, he had this vision of the Niagara Falls and all that water that pours over Niagara Falls all the time. And he said, what if you took that water and channeled it from Lake Erie down a long ditch to Albany? And he started thinking that would really solve all the problems. And he didn't know anything about canals. He studied up on them. He looked at maps. He drew out the route that this could follow, which was pretty close to the route that the Erie Canal followed when they built it. And he even estimated the cost, which was quite close to what it actually cost. And he wrote this all up in a series of essays, which he published anonymously, and it set off a frenzy of interest in building a canal, of which DeWitt Clinton was the leader. He had been mayor of New York. He eventually was governor of New York. And he got up the interest of actually doing a canal. And everybody thought this was great. Not everybody, because some people said they called it the effusions of a maniac. This idea that you could dig a ditch across from Lake Erie all the way down to Albany. And they tried to get the federal government to pay for it. They wouldn't do it. And New York State had to take the risk, and it was an enormous risk. It was like nobody did know if you could actually dig a ditch that went all across the whole state. The longest canal in the country at the time was 27 miles long. The Erie Canal was going to be more than 300 miles, and every canal that had ever been built was through settled areas where the land is already cleared, usually, and there were people living along there to use the canal. This was going to go out into what was mostly wilderness, which out here, if you got past Rome, it was largely wilderness. But they decided, go ahead with it, we'll take the chance. They invested a large portion of the entire capital of New York State in the canal, and in 1860, and they began digging it. It was a tremendous engineering project. They weren't able to use the idea that Hawley had of a single ditch that ran all the way down to Albany because there were too many ups and downs in the middle, so they had to make a level canal. And a level canal has to be totally level. And if you think about it, if you're surveying, and say you survey a mile ahead and you're off by 1 inch, that doesn't seem like anything. But if you go 20 miles, you're off by 20 inches. And the canal was only 4 feet deep, so either it was drying up or it was overflowing. So it had to be a precision that they really didn't have the capability for. They hired judges who knew surveying because they would use it to settle property disputes. And they had to learn on the job how to make a canal. And a level canal is also quite a complicated hydrological project because they couldn't channel the water all the way from Lake Erie because there was rises and falls in the meantime. And for every time it went up and down, they had to find a source of water to keep the canal filled because every time you used the locks, you used a very large amount of water. So it was, and you had to go over every stream. You had to have a way for the stream to get past the canal. So it was a project that Yankee ingenuity would be a good description of how they actually built the canal. And I always refer to, give a perspective on it, the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is 48 miles long. The Erie Canal ended up being 360 miles. And the Panama Canal raises ships up 85 feet above the ocean and then back down again. The Erie Canal raises the barges up 600 feet from Albany to Buffalo. And of course, the Panama Canal was built almost 100 years later, and it was a time when they had steam shovels, dynamite, railroads. For the Erie Canal, they had none of that. And they relied on picks and shovels, wheelbarrows, and a lot of Irishmen, which this is a later, this is a later picture of the Irishmen who built the canal, and pretty much dug it by hand the whole way. So it was an amazing achievement. Why was it important in American history? And the commercial success of it was very important. It was successful from the day it opened, and a lot of trade and stuff went up and down it. But there's a few things that make it important in American history that you might not think of. First of all, it made New York the Empire State. It made New York City the main port of America. So at the time, New York was competing with New Orleans because New Orleans had access to the interior up the Mississippi River. But now with the canal, New York City had access to that whole upper Midwest through the canal. And the resources that came down the canal and products that they sent up really made New York the biggest port in America and established it as the Big Apple, which I don't know why they call it the Big Apple, but that was. Another thing was that they had recently completed the Louisiana Purchase, which was a huge area out west of the Mississippi that a lot of people thought would become another country eventually because it was so remote. It like took weeks to get out there. But once they got the canal finished, you could go out there safely, conveniently, and then come back when you wanted to. And there was connection to the country. So it united the United States in a lot of ways. And the third thing I always mention is the people that moved west on the canal and first came here in western New York and then farther out to Ohio and farther along the Great Lakes were largely from New England. And the other group that came along the canal was immigrants. When they opened the canal in 1825, they had a flotilla of dignitaries came down the canal, and they ran into a boat that was loaded with people, and they were speaking a language that nobody could understand what they were saying. And it turned out, as they finally determined, they were Norwegians, and they were the first Norwegian immigrants to America. They were on their way out to the upper Midwest. And a lot of other Swedish and Scandinavian people followed them and settled in the upper Midwest, and it still has that, Minnesota and Wisconsin still have some of that element of Scandinavian background. And the outcome of this was that it blocked the infiltration of people from the South. They had started to move up into southern Ohio, southern Illinois, and Indiana. Butternuts, they called them. They were just people coming up from the South. But with all this influx of New Englanders and immigrants, none of whom had much interest in slavery or they were completely opposed to slavery, it prevented the Southerners from coming up the Mississippi and spreading slavery into that area. And they soon after the canal was finished, they started talking about, they had originally talked about the settled East and the frontier West. Now they started talking about the free North and the slave South. So it had a huge effect on the course of American history. I'm going to mention a few of the ideas and enthusiasms and religions that grew up along the canal, but a lot of people have asked me, why was it? Why did this happen here? And I think there's a bunch of reasons. One was just the influx of people going back and forth. It was a very dynamic area because so many people would come here, stay a little while, move farther west, and just had mobility that in some place like New England you didn't have. People just stayed in their place where they're born. Another thing was that it was really a youth movement. When the canal got to Rochester, Rochester grew so rapidly that they had to invent this term boom town, and that was first applied to Rochester. It was a boom town. And when it was booming, 3/4 of the people in Rochester were under 30. They brought the excitement and the willingness to take chances and stuff to these movements and got enthusiastic about them. And the third thing is, in the Constitution, which had fairly recently been approved, they had a rule against establishment of religion, which in those days, an establishment of religion was collecting taxes to pay for a particular church, having a state religion. Very common at that time, and it remained, a lot of states continued to do it. It was only the federal government that couldn't do it. Massachusetts had an established religion until 1830s in the Congregational Church, so that you would have to pay taxes to support that religion whether you believed in it or not. But the Constitution got rid of that. That opened up a kind of free market for religion. That anybody that could attract people to their beliefs and willing to pay to support it could have a kind of do-it-yourself religion. So that was the origin of a lot of the religious innovation that happened soon after the Erie Canal opened. And the first group I want to talk about, I can't talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 of these movements. The first one was, this is the Erie Canal. As it was finished, came out of the idea of the camp meetings that they had on the frontier. A lot of these ideas had their roots in camp meetings, and they were people that had come out to very remote areas. There were no churches, there were no towns. They lived out in the wilderness, clearing land, and they have camp meetings, would have a dozen preachers gathering in the woods, and then people came to them, and they'd have a revival over a weekend or a little bit more than that, and then the people had to go back and get back to work because it was endless work to subdue the frontier. So they wanted to get saved, and they wanted to get saved quickly. They didn't want to sit around thinking about it. They wanted to be saved. And the preachers knew that, and there was a lot of hell and brimstone, and they'd say, bark Satan up a tree, and some guy would get in the frenzy, and he would start barking and on his hands and knees, and everybody would gather around and laugh, but someone would go join in, and there were, as they sort of indicates here, it was pretty wild things. That was a whole innovation in religion in America from the camp meeting. And among the sects that then developed, the first one you might not think of was the Shakers. Mother Ann Lee came over just before the Revolutionary War from England, and she brought this idea for a new religion. She gathered some believers together. They started out right near Albany, New York. And the 2 things that everybody knows about the Shakers is, first, they were celibate, and they made nice furniture. But they were really one of the most radical religious groups of all time, which you don't usually associate the Shakers with that. But first of all, it was founded by a woman, very unusual in those days. And she even said women are going to be equal in the Shaker hierarchy. And what do you know? God himself is half man and half woman. So the idea, that was totally wonkers for, most people. It's like, no, God's a man, he's got a long beard. No, she said that the man and woman are come together in the deity. They turned away from the world. Rather than have a Shaker church in every town, they gathered together. They had their own communities, and those communities were communist. They were the first communists in the world, really, and they were the forerunner of many other sects in America going down to the 1960s, forming communes. Some of them were more or less religious, but many of them were associated with religion, and they owned everything together. And somebody once went to visit them. They said, yeah, they have all their possessions are owned together. What they do about their toothbrushes, I was too discreet to ask. And Frederick Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, pointed to the Shakers as proof that communism worked. So that was another very radical thing about them. When they believed in the end of the world. The true name of the Shaker sect is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. They're always just called Shakers, but that was their official name. And they had this idea of the world is coming to an end, or the second coming is about to descend on them. And their services were like, they would do these very unusual dances. This is the furniture they were making, of course. The interesting thing about that was they didn't care about the furniture. They cared about the work that went into it. And they thought work is holy. This is how you get close to God, is you work right. And that was the origin of the furniture. But the furniture itself was not a big deal for them. It was just as simple as they could make it, essentially. But when they had their services, they would get into these dances. They had ritual dances, and they would, after they got heated up, they would start to tremble and shake, and that's how they got the name Shaker. And they would make up hymns and start singing them. And they invited people to come over and sit in bleachers and watch them that were not Shakers. And some people would watch them and were appalled. They thought this was horrifying. Other people thought it was funny. And a few people decided, yes, maybe that's for me, and would join up. So that was, I mentioned them first because they were the origin of a lot of ideas that turn up in other cults that came later, which the first one I'm going to talk about was formed by William Miller. Miller was a farmer in very eastern part of New York, almost up the Vermont border, and he decided that he wanted to find out if the Bible was true. He said, I'm going to read the Bible without any commentary, just look at the words of the Bible and see what I think of it. And he started reading the Bible, and he kept coming across these numbers. And he would do some calculations on the numbers, and every time when he got done adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying, he would come up with 1843, 1843, 1843. Whether you did days, years, 7 times 7, all numbers he found in the Bible, you could come up with 1843. He said the Bible is trying to tell us something. The world's going to end in 1843, and this is like in the late 1820s, around 1830. And so he started preaching, but not preaching like a normal preacher would do, but explaining the mathematics of how the Bible is predicting this 1843. And he got teamed up with another guy named Joshua Himes, who was a great promoter of religion, and he said, you got to really work to get this message out, because there's so many people are going to end up in hell if you don't get they don't get saved before the end of the world. And they bought a circus tent, the largest tent in North America, and they would go down the Erie Canal and have revival meetings in the tent. And they said people would walk for 2 days just to see the tent, which gives you an idea of how hard up they were for entertainment, I guess. And they, as the time drew near, they got more and more people interested in the idea. And Himes told him, William Miller didn't really want to say the exact date, but he said if you tell them the date, that's really going to press them to get saved. So he said, okay, it's going to be on October 22nd. Well, 1843 had come, nothing happened. That was, he said, well, thank God, God is giving us a reprieve until next year. But on October 22nd, 1844, that was the date. And that then circulated and really did spur a lot more movement. And these people were serious. They did not believe this in a metaphorical sense. It was going to be the people who were saved would fly up into the air first. Christ would come on high. Fire would then rain down and everybody left over down below and destroy the earth. And that was going to happen. That was the end of history, it was the beginning of eternity. Well, why send your kids to school? What are you planting crops for? You're not going to be around in the fall and people, a lot of the stories were exaggerated, I have to say, of what the Millerites did. They did put on robes, some of them. They thought if you're going to fly up to heaven, you were going to be dressed for it. But some of those were exaggerated because a lot of animosity about, I was talking to Bob the other day, the church right here, Methodist Church, was divided. And some people believed in the Miller prophecy and split away from the main church. And that happened in other places too. And some people did give away their businesses or their farms. They did gather at Cobb's Hill. They had a gathering to wait on that night to go up. You wanted to be on a high place, a shorter trip. And most of them gathered in each other's homes to wait for midnight on October 22nd. And they had the countdown. And, we think New Year's Eve is a big deal. This was the end of the world. And it got to midnight, and then it was 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and then the sun came up. And that was they call it the great disappointment. I think I would have called it the great relief, but that was their term for it. And the Millerites then largely fell apart. Miller himself said, I don't want to make any more predictions, I'm just going to go and pray. And most of his followers drifted back to the churches and back, except there was a group, a woman up in Maine named Ellen White, who was a Millerite believer, and she said, no, he was right. The world did end spiritually. And then she had her own series of beliefs that extended the Millerite philosophy, and she formed the Seventh-day Adventists. And that has continued, the Millerite idea, down to our own time. And today there's 21 million Seventh-day Adventists around the world, so, which I was surprised that was that common, but it's still very much a viable idea. The next person I want to go into was Charles Grandison Finney in Rochester. If you look at the towns along the Erie Canal, a lot of them have the word port in them. Fairport, Brockport, Port Byron. There's a place up near Buffalo, Gasport. And that was sort of an indication. This was the waterfront. And like the waterfront in many cities, it was a very rowdy element. The canal boat workers and the workers that worked on the canal and the people moving through and transients. A lot of fighting, a lot of prostitution, drinking, and the respectable people in Rochester said, we want to have a revival of religion, because Rochester was one of the rowdiest of the places along the canal. If you're familiar with Sam Patch, and Sam Patch is pretty well known in the Rochester area, he jumped over the Rochester Falls successfully once and unsuccessfully another time. And he's buried up in Mount Hope Cemetery. But that particular incident was the spur that they had to get the best revival preacher going at that time to come to Rochester and straighten things out, because it was just getting out of hand. So they got this guy. And Finney was a real innovator in religion. He had been a lawyer. He was not trained as a doctor of divinity. He was the type of guy that went back to this camp meeting idea, get people saved quick. Only he toned it down enough that it was acceptable in the churches. So he would preach in different churches. He wasn't connected with any particular denomination. And then the people who were saved the churches would try to get them to come to their church. And he was like Billy Graham of his time, only much bigger than Billy Graham, much more famous. Religion was a headline-making affair at that time. They'd been going through the Second Great Awakening since 1800, and religion was bubbling across the country. And he developed many of the techniques of Billy Graham and all the other revival preachers used. He would point to somebody and say, Mr. Smith, if you walk out of here and drop dead, you're going to go to hell. You're going to be in hell for all eternity. And come down here to the anxious bench. And he had a bench set aside for them. They'd come down. People would pray for them. He was a very dynamic speaker, very convincing, saved thousands of people. And that spread all across the country, that last big revival of evangelical Christianity. There was somewhat of a difference between what we think of evangelical now, because they were what today would be considered liberals. They were against slavery. They were somewhat for women's rights, social programs. Whereas today, evangelicals thought it was fairly conservative. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is Joseph Smith Jr. His family came down from Vermont, very poor people, hard-lucked people. They'd lost their farm in Vermont. 1816, they settled in Palmyra, New York, looking for new opportunity down here, more fertile land, got a farm, had to clear the forest off, worked very hard. They would work on their own farm, and then they would go and work in town digging ditches and digging wells for farmers. And they just barely got by. And Joseph, who was a teenager at the time, got into leading treasure hunts to make money. And the treasure hunts were a big fad at the time. The rumor was that Captain Kidd had buried his treasure somewhere around Palmyra. Now, why he brought it up from the ocean, the seaside, all the way 200 miles up to get to Palmyra, I don't know, but that's what they thought. And he was like a dowser, and he would go out and he knew where it was buried. And if they dug down, he would say, well, you didn't dig fast enough. It's going down farther, and they could never quite catch up with it. And it was all pretty much a goof. They drank a lot, and it was fun. They'd go out and dig at night. But then he had a vision that said, an angel appeared to him, and he said, there is gold. It's up on Hill Cumorah. And he went up on Hill Cumorah, dug it up, and found this gold plates. This is a replica, based on his description of the gold plates, conveniently in a 3-ring binder, which he then translated, but he didn't understand how to translate the hieroglyphics, so he just did it by revelation. And he would dictate, and they had a scribe that was writing it down. Came up with a 600-page book, 300 characters, stories within stories, flashbacks, prophecies, all descriptions of how the Indians were formed over here, how America got settled. And whether you think of it as a revelation or an inspiration, or it was one of the most incredible works of literature of the 19th century. And to be produced by this rather uneducated farm boy was unbelievable. A lot of people didn't believe it, but that's what happened. And he didn't stop there. He formed a religion around the book, got some followers around Palmyra, very quickly moved on to the west. He wanted to go out to the west where it was closer to the Indians. The Garden of Eden had actually been in Missouri, he said. And they moved out to the west. They went to Missouri, but then they went back to Illinois, formed a city called Nauvoo, became the second largest city in Illinois after Chicago. Like the Shakers, they gathered together. They didn't have Mormon churches in every town. The Mormons were all going to gather together, and this Nauvoo was all Mormons from around the world. They already sending missionaries around, and all this time, Joseph Smith was having more revelations beyond the Book of Mormon. And one of them was, he read that King Solomon had 300 wives. So he thought that was something he could add on to his. And I've often thought, he also said you couldn't drink coffee. Mormons do not drink coffee, so this may have been the consolation for that. And he said, not only can you, but you must take additional wives in order to reach the highest levels in the church. And so some of his male followers thought it was a good idea. A lot of them didn't. A lot of them were horrified. Their wives were also horrified. And so there then broke away a faction of the Mormons in Nauvoo who believed in Mormonism, but they didn't believe in polygamy. And they started putting out their own newspaper. Excuse me. And Joseph Smith got up a goon squad and sent them over to break up their printing press and beat these people up. And he kind of forgot, he's still in the United States, he was in the state of Illinois, and there were laws. So the dissident Mormons had him arrested, he was put in jail, and while he was in jail, some non-Mormons who hated Mormons, they were roundly hated everywhere, broke into the jail and killed him, essentially lynched him. He was 39 years old. He had, it had been 14 years since he translated the Book of Mormon and the time he was killed. He never made it out to Utah. Brigham Young, who lived around here, was over in Mendon, had grown up in Auburn partly, led the Mormons then from Nauvoo. They closed down and moved out to Utah. And one of the incredible things was that the Book of Mormon, which was a Broadway musical, became one of the most successful Broadway musicals of all time. It's taken in, so it started in 2011, still going strong today on Broadway, and has taken in $800 million in revenues. So, interesting little tidbit. I mentioned commercial success of the Erie Canal. This was Syracuse in the heyday of the canal. If you see it today, it's sad. You know, where this is overpasses in 1 year, the canal took in. They were so successful they took in more in fees than the entire cost of building a canal. So it was like a great vision for infrastructure. And people have asked me, and I don't know the answer, why now our infrastructure is deteriorating? Why don't we have the gumption and the foresight that they had then? I can't explain it, but that they were certainly had a lot of foresight, and it was very successful. Not all canals were successful, but that one was. When it got to, they had already enlarged the canal from the original 4-foot deep ditch during the 1800s, and it got up to about 1900. They had to decide whether to keep it going or modernize it, make it deeper, and they decided to go ahead with it. They spent a lot of money. They abandoned the eastern part of the canal entirely. They turned the Mohawk River into a canal with dams and locks. They went through Oneida Lake. They rerouted it around the cities. It used to go right through the middle of Rochester as well as Syracuse. And they, and then in the western part, they kept the same route, but electric locks, deeper, bigger locks. But the barges that I saw going through the canal when I was a kid was really the end of an era, because in 1959 they opened the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that allowed ships to come down the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario and the Welland Canal into Lake Erie. There's much bigger, vastly bigger than a canal barge, and pretty much erased the commercial advantage of the canal and became mainly a recreational and quite an amenity for the towns that have passed through. That they now have a lot of restaurants and bars along the canal. And one of the things that that changed when they created what they called the barge canal, they have since changed the name back to the Erie Canal, but was the mules. The reason they had mules in the Erie Canal, because they had steamboats even before the canal was finished, but they couldn't use steamboats in the canal because either the paddle wheels or the propeller would stir up the water so much that it would create leaks, so it just had a clay lining. So they always had the mules pulling them along the shore. But when they did this modernization, they got rid of the mules. And in 1905, a man named Thomas Allen wrote this song about the Erie Canal, particularly about the mules, and it was already a nostalgic song, the mules and the 15 miles on the Erie Canal, looking back to a different time, earlier time, simpler time that people remembered then. Even in 1905, they were looking back, and it was a song that many of us learned in the 3rd grade, and it was about an earlier time when things were different in America, and you always knew your neighbor, and you always knew your pal if you ever navigated on the Erie Canal. So that's the talk. I would be happy to take questions. If you go to my website, jackkellybooks.com, and I've got the true story of America's Most Hated Man, as well as that's my latest book. I've got some copies of Heaven's Ditch in the back. You can sign up. I have a newsletter that's on Substack that you get a free little history essay every week and keep up on what I'm doing. And thank you all for coming. So does anybody have a yes? Oh,
Mike.
oh, yeah. We want to get you on record.
When they started using the Mohawk River, did they have to have locks on the river, or was the river pretty level?
No, that's an interesting question, because when Jesse Hawley was trying to get his flour down, they even used the Mohawk River at times for that, too. It was very undependable. It went up and down a lot. And so they had to put in the dams, the locks, and then they had big reservoirs a little bit farther up in the Adirondack Mountains that fed the water down to keep it at a fairly, enough water to keep the barges going through it. So that was the answer to that question, yeah.
Another comment, was the Mohawk River the lowest break in the Appalachian Mountains?
Pretty much the only way through, yeah. If you get into the geology of it, during the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, as the ice receded, the St. Lawrence River was still blocked. So all the water that comes over Niagara Falls and is flowing through the Great Lakes had to go somewhere, and it went out through the Mohawk River and down the Hudson River. And that wore that passage through the mountains at a place called Little Falls. And that's where the canal goes through there, and that was a passage through, even for land traffic, you didn't have to go up and down so much. But that, yeah, that was true.
Just as a point of interest to those in the Victor area, you talked about the Millerites, and they actually did have a place where they worshiped or met, which was on the northeast corner of Church Street, in that building right there.
That was the Millerite faction of the Methodist, or just the local Millerites, right? Yeah.
How many barges were on the canal at its heyday? I'm fine, thanks. How many barges they had at its heyday? I know it was very short-lived because of the railroads, but when it was at its max?
That's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that, how many barges. There were what they call packet boats. There were passenger boats. The people that wanted to travel along a canal would go on a packet boat. And then there were barges. Many of them, the families lived on the barge that ran the barge, and they had a stable on the barge that they would have mules stabled there, and then they have other mules pulling. And then when they'd done their 15 miles, they would change mules, and they would have a fresh one so they could keep going.
I was gonna ask you that next, if they had stables along the canal or what?
They also had stables along the canal, but the ones that could afford 4 mules would use their own mules, or they had these sort of public service where you'd lease mules going from one stable to another. But that was the origin. Sometimes they say 15 years on the Erie Canal, which didn't really make any sense. It was 15 miles was sort of what they figured was the average mule could pull in their time. Yeah.
This is back to the Mohawk River. I was not aware that the Mohawk was not part of the original plan. So where was the original ditch and what happened to it?
Well, if you go up there, the original, what they call Clinton's Ditch, was the original 4-foot canal. That went on one route. And then the enlarged canal, in places, was the same route, and places they shortened it or modified it. So there's remnants of both of those. There are very few remnants of Clinton's Ditch. There's one in in one of those towns up there that have a little museum, and it's the original Clinton's ditch. It really is, it looks like a ditch. Then the enlarged canal, there's a place out on the thruway you go that was an old lock from the enlarged canal. That was the new route that when they enlarged it, and that had been an embankment. There must have been an embankment along there, but now it just sort of stands out naked and you can pull off the thruway and look at it. So there's remnants of both of them along the way. It was on the south side of the Mohawk River, though. The new locks, the barge canal locks, are on the north side, starting at Waterford, I think it is, and went up from there up to the canal, up to they had to get around the falls at Cohoes. There's quite a big waterfall there. And that's where one interesting thing was that the first passenger railroad was built from Albany to Schenectady. That was the first passenger railroad in America in 1831, because there's so many locks to get the canal up from sea level up to even where Schenectady is. There were many locks, and it took more than a day to get through that. So they got this railroad, and you could just go to Schenectady, get on a canal boat there, and it saved you that amount of time. And they used the first locomotive in America to pull that passenger line. Yeah.
I noticed you didn't have the Genesee Valley Canal. I noticed you didn't have the Genesee Valley Canal as part of your presentation. My sense is you probably know all about it. That went from Port Bill at the Pennsylvania border and came up to Rochester. And basically it locked into the Allegheny River there, and then that became a way to get to Pittsburgh, and then so far, and eventually you were in New Orleans.
Yeah. Yeah, that was after the Erie Canal opened in 1825. There became this frenzy for canal building because everybody saw how successful it was, and they had the Black River Canal went up north, and they had that canal and other ones out in the Midwest that came off of the Erie Canal. A lot of those were not as successful. They were just sort of political. Oh, we got to have a canal, that we want to be modern. Let's get a canal down here, and they just didn't have the traffic, and the canal had drawbacks. One of them, of course, being that it closed down in the winter. And so you look at it today, they still haven't filled it up. They drain it to this day, they drain it every winter. And at first they thought they could use icebreakers, and it just didn't work. And that, again, it stirred up the water so much that it leaked. So they closed it every winter. So that, the end of the commerce for all canals. They built the Delaware and Hudson Canal. I lived down near Kingston, and that went from the coal fields in Pennsylvania up over the mountains, and then they had sort of like an engine that pulled the cars up to the top, and then they would slide down to the canal and then bring anthracite coal to New York City. They'd bring it down to Kingston and go down to New York. That was one of the more successful of the canals, just because they had that really valuable product that could bring them. So, yeah.
Why were mules used instead of horses?
What?
Why were mules used instead of horses?
Well, they did use horses too. I guess mules were just, stronger for the amount of oats they ate. I'm not sure. That's a good question. Mules were quite common for farm work too.
It's cheaper to buy a mule than a horse.
Yeah, that might have been too. Yeah, but there were horses that pulled on the canal too. So the mule became the sort of iconic animal for.
Related to a donkey, and they're stupid.
Yeah.
Is the Finney School in Penfield named after this guy Finney that you talked about?
I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not even familiar with that. Finney School in Penfield. Is it a religious school?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it probably was. He actually started Oberlin College out in Ohio. He founded that, which is still, considered fairly liberal. I don't know if it has really any religious connection anymore, but he founded, he was a great reformer as well as a preacher. Yeah.
Do you know if Joseph Smith's family bought into his religion? They head west with him?
Some of them did. They had a split when Brigham Young took the vast majority of Mormons out to Utah. Smith's wife, who had gotten pretty pissed off about the polygamy thing, and most of her children, I think, and I don't know about his brothers, he had some brothers as well, but they did stay in Ohio, and there was a fairly big, in Illinois, and there's a fairly big sect of non-polygamous Mormons that were, and I think still exist in Ohio. They're separate from the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints out in, the polygamy began, started a real rat's nest of complications for them, and they gave it up when they wanted to become a state. The federal government said you cannot become part of the United States as a state until you give up polygamy, and so the guy who was the head of it then had a revelation and said that should give up. But then it was always questions, did they really go by that revelation, or did they just say they were doing it? Because there were these fundamentalist sects and some of them come out in modern times. I was in a town called Colorado City in Arizona, and they were a Mormon fundamentalist group there, and that was like the Twilight Zone. All the women wore these 1800s clothing and hairdos, and they were a racket, really. And the leader of that group eventually came afoul of the law and fled to Texas, and finally they arrested him. I think he went to jail. So,
Do you know if his parents, did Joseph Smith's parents buy into that, or did they stay in Palmyra?
They may. I should know that. I can't remember. I think his father may have died before they went out there, and I'm not sure about his mother. I think his mother at least went out there, but didn't. She may have died while because they were in Nauvoo for quite a while, quite a number of years. So, we're still going. Yeah.
When you say they drain the canal, where does the water go? Drain.
Well, they have outlets as well as inlets for the canals. If you go along, sometimes near the lock, somewhere else, it'll have drained out of the canal, and they have other places water's draining in.
So like on Lake Ontario, or?
Well, no, they were either from natural lakes and ponds that were higher level than the canal, or they would have to build a reservoir. So they had some reservoirs. When it did come from Lake Erie, as far as Lockport, and the water, they had to go through solid rock to get it down to the level of Lake Erie, but the Lake Erie water came right down the canal, and then in Lockport, it ran all those locks, plus they had mills there, and they would funnel off some of the water to run the mills, which was a big deal in Lockport at the time. And then it went down to the big level from Lockport to close to Rochester, and then there was some ups and downs that they couldn't use the water, Lake Erie water after that. They had to have other sources. They had a source from the Genesee River. There was a side canal that ran into the Erie Canal that took water from the Genesee.
They do that today?
I think so, but I'm not sure about that.
This is the Genesee.
It was out by the U of R somewhere. The original canal went down where 490 is. That was the canal path when it went through Rochester, but when they rerouted it, it now flows, they put a dam in the Genesee to keep the water level, and the canal comes in and goes out at the same level, so they just go across the river. So they don't, I guess that would, the answer to that would be the water flows right through there. They don't need, they had taken it up to, and I'm going to get the street wrong, but one of the streets in Rochester was the old aqueduct that carried the canal through the city right by the library.
Broad Street Bridge.
Broad Street, yeah. And you could still, I think, go down and see the old aqueduct. And they were going to develop that, but I don't know if they ever did. Yeah. Got to get the
I was going to say,
microphone.
your book mentions we got God, we got gold. Can you tell us what the murder is?
Oh, yeah, the murder, well, I used to always say, you got to buy the book to find out. But in addition to Joseph Smith, who really was murdered, I'll tell this story really quickly. There was a guy named William Morgan, and he was he worked on the canal, they think. He lived up around this area somewhere. He had married a quite attractive woman named Lucinda Pendleton, and he was a go-getter. And he thought a good way to get going was to join the Masons. The Masons were very popular at the time, Freemasons. So he joined up, and sure enough, he got a job in Batavia doing something, working up there. And he was an ornery character. He had a falling out with the Freemasons. And he said, well, I'm going to get back at them. I'm going to write the book revealing all their secrets of the Freemasons. And the secrets were kind of innocuous. It was like initiation rites and special signs they had of distress signs and stuff. But he said, I'm going to reveal all that. And they said, do not do that. He had to swear not to do it. Every Mason swore that, don't do it. And he said, well, I'm going to do it. They tried to burn down his printer that was printing his book. I think he thought it was going to be a bestseller. He was like every author, you know. And then he was arrested, and he was taken from Batavia to Canandaigua. And he was put in jail in Canandaigua for a debt that he owed there. It was sort of a trumped-up charge, but he did owe this money. While he was there, some Freemasons walked in and said, we'll pay for his debt. And they paid off the debt, but then they took him out, holding onto his arms, and put him in a closed carriage. And he went through here, I think. And in fact, there was a guy named Gillis from Victor, who was one of the few people who was later convicted of kidnapping him. But they know that he went through here, through Rochester, out to Fort Niagara. And Fort Niagara was abandoned at that time. It was just a derelict fort. And they imprisoned him there, and then he was never seen again. And so it was assumed that they, in their I always thought, well, they were like, they were Masons, but they weren't like George Washington was a Mason, DeWitt Clinton was a Mason. They were sort of sophisticated Masons. These guys were hick Masons, and they took it a little more seriously than they should have, and they killed him.
They were from Victor.
I know, that's a head scratcher. But, and then controversy broke out because people said, why aren't the authorities solving this murder? They don't seem to be doing anything. And they did arrest these guys, Gillis and these other guys that were Masons, but they got a slap on the wrist. They didn't give them any for killing somebody. And so they said there's a conspiracy going on. And this was really, in some ways, one of the earliest conspiracy theories in American history, that the Masons were taking over. And so they got up and people said, look, at the judges are Masons, the sheriff's a Mason, this guy's a Mason, politicians are all Masons, they're taking over. And they're going to get rid of democracy and they're going to put in an aristocratic government. And that became the anti-Masonic party. And it was very big in Rochester. They'd have brawls between the anti-Masons and the pro-Masons, I guess you'd say. And it was a time of sort of fluid time in politics. And the anti-Masons ran candidates for office. And then in the middle of the election campaign, the body floated up on Lake Ontario, was found on the shore. It's William Morgan, and this was like more than a year later. It's William Morgan, and they brought his wife, Lucinda Pendleton, up to look at the body, and she said, "That's my husband. I can tell by the clothes." They couldn't tell by the corpse was pretty deteriorated. The Masons got another woman from Canada. She came down and said, "No, that's my husband. He drowned," and she had verified that he had drowned not too long ago. Well, that was a little more believable because if the guy had been in the water for a year, it wouldn't have. But what about the clothes? They buried him as William Morgan in Batavia. They had a big procession out there, the anti-Mason movement. He was their hero. And then they ran a candidate for president in 1832. Some of the big politicians of the time started as anti-Masons, of which John Quincy Adams was in the party for a while, Millard Fillmore, who later became president. William Seward was a big anti-Mason, and the anti-Masons sort of morphed into the Republican Party. And he was a candidate for president of the Republican Party. It just got barely beat out by Lincoln in 1860. So they were a big factor in American politics. And there really was no conspiracy. The whole thing was just, William Miller, it was a bunch of guys operating on their own, probably. What actually happened to Miller, there were many stories that the Masons put out, that he was in Europe, he'd been seen here and he'd been seen there, he was never killed, he was just out in hiding. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries, murder mysteries in American history. And I always thought the interesting wrap up to it was that his wife, and they had a couple of kids too, and she was very broken up by this fact that her husband was, but she became famous as well. And the anti-Masons held her up, the widow of William Morgan. She was quite a celebrity for a time. Finally, she gave up on him. I guess after the body was discovered, she figured he's dead. And she got married again in Batavia, a guy named Harris. So then she was Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris. They moved to Ohio. And while they were in Ohio, they were converted to Mormonism by some missionary going through there. And they decided to move to Nauvoo. And so they moved to Nauvoo, and Lucinda became the first, what they called plural wife, the polygamous wife of Joseph Smith. So she was Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris Smith, again in the public spotlight as famous person. Again, her husband was murdered. And after that, she sort of faded away in the historical record, but that was, in the small world department, that was quite a coincidence.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
If you have any other questions or comments and you want to talk to Jack afterwards, you're welcome. He has some of his books back here if you want to take a look, or if you wanted to buy one, they're probably for sale. Thank you all for coming.